So now that we've discussed porphyrins and cnidarians, let's move on to the clade of Bilateria. So Bilateria is essentially all of the groups of animals besides sponges and cnidarians, meaning every organism that has bilateral symmetry. Most of these organisms have a coelom and a complete digestive tract with a mouth and an anus. I said most, not all. We'll talk about one in a moment that does not. And this clade, Bilateria, these bilaterally symmetrical organisms, include three groups of phyla: Lophotrochozoa, Ecdysozoa, and Deuterostomia. And as you can see here, right, we have cnidarians branched off here. This is all Bilateria. And we're going to talk about Lophotrochozoa first, right, which is going to be this group here. Now, Lophotrochozoa was not a traditional group of phyla from the old, primarily morphological and developmental phylogenies. This is something that came about because of molecular data. When we started to be able to look at protein amino acid sequences and nucleic acid sequences and genes, it became clear that these organisms should be grouped together. Now, some of them do have anatomical structures that tie them together. A lophophore is a feeding structure that many of them, that we call lophophorates, possess. Many of them have a trochophore larval stage, which is a particular type of larva. But a lot have neither. Okay? And this is going to include platyhelminthes, the flatworms, rotifers, ectoprocs, brachiopods, mollusks, annelids, all of which we'll talk about in a moment. We're going to start with the simplest phylum, which are the flatworms, or platyhelminthes, right? Platyhelminthes, which I do want you to know. And these are triploblastic, right? Unlike cnidarians, which are diploblastic, or porphyrins, which have no tissue at all. But they do not have coeloms. They are acoelomates, right? So they don't have a pseudocoelom or a true coelom. They are acoelomates. They're flat, right? And they don't have that extra tube within a tube. And in addition to that, they are dorsoventrally flattened, right? So not like this way flattened, but like this way flattened. And they are primarily able to exchange gas just across the surface of their body. Because they're so flat, they actually have a relatively high surface area to volume ratio. Most recent phylogenies have separated flatworms into two main lineages. Catanulida, or chainworms, there are only about 100 species of these, so we're not going to talk much about them. And Rhabdophora, which include a lot of different kinds of flatworms. There are about 20,000 species of these, so pretty much everything we talk about is going to be in this category. Now, there are several free-living species within Rhabdophora, and the most famous are planarians, and we did a little bit with them in lab, you'll see. They have light-sensitive eye spots, they have centralized nerve nets, they have a way to have internal fertilization, so they can reproduce sexually internally. They also can reproduce asexually through fission. Mostly as a repair mechanism. If you cut them in half, both sides can regrow, even if you cut them front to back. If you cut them front to back, the back can grow a new head. Right? It's pretty wild. And this is what these free-living planarians look like. Here are the eye spots. These are not image-forming eyes, so they can just tell light and dark, and then they can tell which direction that's coming from. They tend to avoid the light. They have cephalization, and cephalization is important. This is a trait that means you tend to move in a direction, right? So things that are either hunters or looking for debris or whatever to eat, they're not planktonic. They're not just floating around, or they're not sessile. They're not still. They move, and you tend to move in a direction, right? So this says something about their ecology. And if you move in a direction, you want all your sensory organs in the part of your body that's in the front, right? So that you can detect things that you're heading towards. And so again, this is true of the eye spots here. They've also got some feeling organs here. And when you have a lot of sensory organs in one place, you end up getting a lot of nervous tissue there, and that leads to something like a brain. These are ganglia not technically a brain, but there's something like a brain. And they have a central nervous system. They have 2 nerve cords that go down, one on each side. And this is different from cnidarians, which have neurons, but they have a nerve net that's just distributed equally around their body. It's not centralized. They also have a single mouth, no anus, so this is just in and out the same hole. And then they have this digestive cavity, this gastrovascular cavity with lots of offshoots and wiggles to increase surface area so that all the cells on the inside of this planarian can get food and also oxygen. And their mouth is not in the front, it's in the middle, on the bottom, and they have this pharynx that kind of shoots out, and they'll just like crawl over something they're going to eat and put their mouth down. No, a lot of these Rhabdophorans are parasitic. Right? There are a lot of parasitic flatworms, and there are 2 main groups of parasitic flatworms: the trematodes, which are sometimes called the flukes, and tapeworms. Now, you've probably heard of tapeworms. You may have heard of like liver flukes or heart flukes. Trematodes are known largely for their complex life cycles. They tend to parasitize a wide range of hosts, and they tend to alternate between different hosts at different life stages. So trematodes that parasitize humans, like liver flukes, often spend, or always spend, part of their life in snail hosts as well, and they're pretty good at mimicking our surface proteins so they can hide from our immune system. And this is what that life cycle looks like, right? So adult flukes will live in an adult mammal, right? And they will then reproduce sexually, right? They will produce sperm and eggs. There are male and female flukes. The eggs then come out through your poo-poo and develop into a ciliated larval form, which can swim because of the cilia. And that will find a snail, and then it will grow up in the snail until it becomes a motile larva. So it's got like a tail, it can swim a little more effectively than here. And then it bursts out of the rear end of the snail and finds a human. And so this is especially bad when we poop where we drink, right? And so then you're much more likely to get these parasites. And there are examples of parasites, nematodes as well, which we'll talk about, and some closely related organisms that can actually affect the behavior of their host, right? So that may infect something out of the water, and then they have to come back to the water for a particular part of their life cycle, and so they make the organism thirsty or make them attracted to water in some way that they wouldn't normally be. Parasitic mind control. Tapeworms are much simpler, right? They just absorb nutrients from the host's intestine. They live inside your gut, and so they don't actually have to have their own gut. They don't have a digestive tract at all. They just absorb nutrients that you have already broken down for them. You're welcome, tapeworm. Tapeworms have a scolex, which is what this looks like up here. It looks like a head, kind of, but it's not. And these are not eyes, they're suckers, and these are hooks. And this is how it grabs onto your intestinal wall. And then in addition to the scolex, they have segments coming back here that are called proglottids. And these proglottids reproduce asexually. You produce more and more and more of them. But each proglottid has reproductive structures that make sperm and egg, and they will swap sperm and egg and make eggs, make fertilized eggs, I should say, that get released again with your stool. And these can grow really, really long, and these adult proglottids, these largest ones, can break off the end full of fertilized eggs that again can go out through your poop and move on to somebody else. Again, this is why we do not poop where we drink. Can lead to parasites. Moving on from phylum Platyhelminthes to a different phylum, Rotifera. The rotifers are really tiny little animals that are often aquatic. You find them in freshwater, but sometimes also the ocean, sometimes also just damp areas. And they, again, have a mouth, but they also have an anus. And their kind of characteristic structure are these cilia up here. Right, it's called a corona because it looks like a crown and it moves, and I'm going to show you a video here in a moment. And this is what they look like when they're moving. And this is what they look like when they're moving. So this is the corona up here, and it sort of feeds food, moves it in toward the mouth and down here to where this structure is that crunches up the food there. So here it just went hiding, and now it's coming back out, and yeah, now you can see that corona moving again. This is a rotifer. Now, aside from that full digestive tract, full alimentary canal with mouth and anus, which is very beneficial because, again, then you don't have to finish digesting what's in your gut and get rid of it before you can eat something else, right? I don't have to get rid of breakfast before I have lunch because I have a full alimentary canal. But they're also interesting because a lot of them reproduce by parthenogenesis, meaning females just produce an egg that's diploid. They don't have to have it fertilized. And so males are unnecessary, and some of them can reproduce either sexually or asexually through parthenogenesis, but in some species there are no males and haven't been for millions of years because the males are unnecessary. Another couple of phyla that you find in Lophotrochozoa are the Lophophorate phyla. And these are phyla that have lophophore, which are feeding structures that look a little bit like what you have in the rotifer, but they're a bit different. They're ciliated tentacles around the mouth, and the two phyla that have these lophophores are Ectoprox and Brachiopods. Ectoprox here look kind of like plants. You can see this lophophore here. And they're colonial, right? They often live in these big colonial groups, and some of them actually produce reefs, sort of like coral do, although, again, they're not in the same phylum as coral, but they can produce hard outer structures. If I move over here, you can see this is a brachiopod, and its lophophore is on the inside of a bivalve shell. So these look like clams or oysters, at least superficially, but they're not. They are different. Clams and oysters are mollusks, which we'll talk about in a moment. But if they open up, they've got this lophophore feeding structure in here, which you can't see very well, but it looks a lot like this. Another way that brachiopods look different from clams and oysters, other bivalves, is that they tend to have a stalk coming down from the bottom of them and anchoring them in the bottom. So they're sometimes called like lampshell fish because of this stalk. And they're also very often found in fossils, especially around here. So we live in a wonderful area for fossils from a couple of different eras, like world famous for like the Devonian period, for instance. And you'll find fossils like this, which look like clams or oysters, but they're brachiopods. You find them all over here. So much so that this is actually the state fossil of Kentucky across the river. So now we're going to move on to another Lophotrochozoan phylum, annelids, the segmented worms. And annelids are coelomates, and their major defining characteristic is their segments, right? And they're traditionally divided into three main clades: the polychaetes, the oligochaetes, and then Hyrodinia, which include the leeches. Now, this is a group that's been shuffled around a lot due to some recent molecular analysis into two main clades, Aurantia and Sedentaria. Aurantia means mobile, so most of the members of Aurantia are mobile. Now, this includes a lot of the old polychaetes, right? And one major anatomical feature is parapodia, which means beside feet. They're like almost feet. And if you look here, right, each of these segments on either side has a parapodium. These kind of look like feet, but they're not. They're parapodia, and then they have setae that stick out from there, which are little bristles that help them grip. So this is an Aurantian, again, would have been called a polychaete, old school. That's sort of what I'm used to. The other group, sedentarians, include some less mobile organisms, many of which would have been less mobile polychaetes, but it also includes earthworms and leeches. So here's a sedentarian that would have been a polychaete, right? This is that worm we looked at earlier. We have the leeches, which if you see have segments, they are blood suckers. They secrete something called hyaridin, which thins out your blood, and they also secrete anesthetic to keep you from realizing you've been bit. And another example of a sedentarian is an earthworm, which would have been in the group Oligochaeta. And you can see they don't have parapodia, but they do have little setae, which help them grip the ground. They have a ventral nerve cord. They have something called a clitellum that collects eggs and sperm. And they are very important ecologically in terms of turning over soil, turning old leaf litter into soil. They're great for composting, for instance.